Good afternoon. Good afternoon,
Hello,
Greg.
how are you?
Hi, thanks very much for joining us today on Radio Jones.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, you're over in Vietnam at the moment, I understand.
I am, yeah. I'm based in Bangkok, but I'm in Vietnam right now, so.
Right. The reason I've asked you on today, you're obviously an award-winning documentary photographer, and your work is you've covered many tragic situations of displaced people. This particular issue that we're looking at today is to do with the Rohingyan Muslims in Myanmar, and you've just published a book which is a documentary photo history, I suppose, of the plight of Burma's Rohingyan people. Exiled to Nowhere is the name of the book, and the photographs are incredibly moving. And just to say that later on in the programme, I have from Human Rights Watch in Thailand, I have Phil Robertson, who's going to be bringing us up to date with current news from there. But Greg, I've asked you on today to tell us, to share, I suppose, with us your experience of actually being with the Rohingyan people. Could you start by telling us when you first went to Burma to seek out these people?
Well, I mean, I started my work on the Rohingya back in the beginning of 2006. And at that particular time, access to the Rakhine state in Burma was quite difficult for journalists. And also, so most of my work actually was done in Bangladesh. The book Exiled to Nowhere is done. It's basically chronicling the plight of the Rohingya who live in Bangladesh. And right now, there's estimated to be around 300,000 Rohingya that live in Bangladesh. Most of them have all fled their homeland of Burma for human rights abuse reasons, and are pretty much unwanted and unwelcome everywhere else in the world. They're not recognized as, most of them are not recognized as refugees in Bangladesh, and as well as other third countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and everything. So my work, most of my work for this particular book tries to kind of open a window into the abuse that the Rohingya face in Burma. Most of the Rohingya who live in Burma, they live in this area called North Rakhine, and it's completely closed off to the rest of the world. I mean, no foreigners can go in there except for a small number of international NGO workers. But the recent violence that happened last summer was, I guess a bit of a surprise to most people in the sense that it happened in the capital of the Rakhine state of Sittwe. I've visited Sittwe twice since the violence, once in November and then again this just last or a month and a half ago in February. And I'd say that I think that in my experiences in both in working with the Rohingya community in Bangladesh and in Burma, probably the most striking thing for me is that here you have a community that's lived in this particular country in Myanmar for hundreds of years. Yet at the same time, they are unrecognized as belonging to the fabric of Burman society. Since 1982, they have been a stateless community, unrecognized as one of the 135 national races of Burma. And since then, they've technically been a stateless community, a stateless people. They have no place to call home. And because of that, it opens them up to a number of different kind of human rights abuses, vulnerabilities, exclusion, and so forth.
Now, you mentioned there 1982. That was when the Burmese government, as was then, actually passed a law to take away their citizenship, and in so doing actually engineered the situation whereby the people without citizenship have no identification. They can't get work. They carry no papers. They are unidentifiable people. So not only are they displaced geographically, but they're also people with no proof of who they are, with no identity. And you mentioned previously that a lot of your work was carried out just inside Bangladesh, where a lot of the Rohingyans have fled to. And this is essentially in a no man's land, I understand. So that area of on the edge of Bangladesh there is essentially a refugee camp, is it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think across the border in Bangladesh, you have roughly 26,000 Rohingya who are recognized as refugees, and they have actually been living in two Bangladesh government and UNHCR monitored refugee camps since 1992. So realistically, you have several generations of recognized Rohingya who have been living as refugees for nearly 20 years in Bangladesh, with very little hope of any kind of sustained future for them and their families. The other remaining 260 or 80,000 Rohingya who live in Bangladesh really are living clandestinely. They're unrecognized. And in general, the Rohingya people who live in the community who live in Rakhine are a stateless people. They have no place to call home. They're unrecognized by the Burmese government as being citizens of Myanmar, and they're unrecognized as being citizens of Bangladesh or any other country in the world. So in a lot of ways, this particular community has fallen into, like you say, a no man's land. They really are unwanted and unwelcome by pretty much everybody. And because of that, they are, a lot of times fall out of the protection of laws. They are exploited. They are vulnerable. And in a reality, they cannot, they're paralyzed by being able to progress normally and contribute to society like most people in the world. They can't work legally. They can't go to school. Most of them do not hold documents. Children are never issued birth certificates. They can't travel freely. And probably, one of the most tragic elements of all this is that this is a community of roughly 1 million people who have lived in a place for hundreds of years, and who really cannot call their homeland, the place that they consider to be home, technically their home.
We've mentioned over the last 5 minutes a number of points in time, as you quite rightly said there, over the last few hundred years. In 1982, when the Burmese government took away their citizenship, 2006, you mentioned that you started looking at these people on the border of Bangladesh. And of course, there is, if you dig deep enough, there is plenty of information in the news, although sadly, really not headline news enough, not mainstream news enough in the international media, but nonetheless there is news about what's happening to these Rohingyan people right now. Greg, what I'd like you to give us, if you could now, is an idea of what these people are, the fabric of these people who are compromised to the point of having nothing, as I understand it, because of their plight over such a long period of time, because of being displaced, because of the hatred waged against them by what essentially we come to believe is a peace-loving nation, because it's a nation of Buddhists, but from it's clear to see that there is a huge amount of hatred from some certain quarters of the Buddhist community towards these people. But these people are, because they can't work, they have nowhere to live, they're malnourished, they're struggling, they're suffering, they're homeless. Many of them have had to flee on boats and have had to turn back from the destinations they've hit upon. I mean, what kind of, when you were amongst these people, give us an idea of these people, what they're like.
Well, I mean, I think that the Rohingya people that I've spent time with over the past 7 years, I think that, they're an incredibly resourceful community. They are amazingly adaptable to the very difficult situations that they're placed under. It's a very religious community, and at the same time, it's a very hardworking community. You go to Sittwe, or you hear about the situation of the Rohingya living in Sittwe, and they were all very, very important elements to the economy of that particular region, whether it be fishing or in the markets. The same exact thing holds true for the Rohingya community who have been living in Bangladesh. I mean, they contribute immensely to the economy of Bangladesh as well. But I think that because of any number of different reasons, whether it be the lack of recognition, all the various hurdles and obstacles that are put in front of them by not being recognized, the abuse that they face on a regular basis over the past 40 years in Myanmar, and the neglect that they face in Bangladesh, I think a lot of times has driven them to take these very, very difficult decisions that have fanned them out throughout the Southeast Asia region and beyond. Yet at the same time, I do think that one thing that people don't particularly recognize, again, I'll go back to, is just kind of this determination that this particular community has to survive from day to day based on the obstacles and the challenges that have been placed upon them for several decades by the Burmese government. And I do think that there's obviously is this very venomous kind of tension between the Rohingya Muslim community in Rakhine and the Buddhist Rakhine community in this particular state. But what I also think that people need to realize is that much of this has been manufactured by the Burmese government for the past 40 or 50 years. I mean, a lot of these tensions, yes, they might be in the DNA of the two particular communities, but at the same time, both communities have really been manipulated by various and successive Burmese governments. And this has really, in a lot of ways, sparked this recent conflict that has been going on in Rakhine that has displaced so many tens of thousands of Rohingya, and now obviously is spreading to other areas of the country.
Now, we've seen just over the last few days the reinstatement of privately owned printed media in Burma. Up until just the last few days, it's been only state-controlled printed media. So one assumes that there is some opening up of information, shall we say, sharing of information. One thing I must say, Greg, is that I noticed that on the headlines of most of the news channels that I referred to on the day that the media was opened up in Burma, that was a headline story on most news channels. But the actual situation of the Rohingya Muslims isn't. It's something that you have to dig deep to find. Would you imagine that the opening up of the media there is going to have any impact on the situation of the plight of the Muslims?
Well, I mean, I guess you would hope so. I mean, I can't particularly give you a strict answer for how it's going to all play out. I think that's the dangerous part of all this situation, that most people can't really predict how this is all going to play out in Burma with this particular community. I mean, I would hope that the transparency and the opening of the media in Burma will help inform people, and actually through a variety of different kind of news sources, independent news sources in the country, will actually help to educate people and break down some of these stereotypes and stigmas that have been built about the Rohingya community over the past 40 years in Burmese society. But I also do think that I think one of the ways that people are going to really be engaged in the country on what is actually happening with this particular with the Rohingya community, as well as the these recent events against the Muslim community in Greater Burma itself, I guess, is more engagement from the Burmese leadership in the government. I think that I think a lot of people are a little bit shocked that there hasn't been as much talk from some of the leaders on the higher levels of the Burmese government that really want to engage and try to find out what are the problems with this. How does Burmese society and the government move forward in trying to find durable solutions to this particular problem with the Rohingya community? I think another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, the story of the Rohingya and the problem with the Rohingya is actually a regional problem. It really is. Over the past few years, it has become a regional problem. But at the heart of this problem rests the abuse that this particular and the challenges that this particular community faces inside of Burma, which is their homeland.
Do you you spent time in Burma? Did you manage to get any kind of response from people within the communities there who are themselves feeling resentment towards that particular ethnicity, the Rohingyans? In other words, did you actually speak to anybody who was discriminatory towards them?
Well, I've on my trip in November, I met with people within the various Rakhine political parties, the RNDP and the ALD, and had long conversations with all of them. And I think that hearing the Rakhine perspective of this particular story is incredibly interesting, but at the same time, there was really no kind of dialogue coming from them, at least in my own conversations with them, to kind of recognize and try to find some kind of solution that actually is beneficial to both communities. What you find happening in Rakhine right now is almost a complete and total apartheid kind of like segregation between the Buddhist community in Rakhine and the Muslim Rohingya community. And I think that part of this has been, again, been influenced by the Burmese government's behavior in the matter. But at the same time, there is a very, very little signs of reintegrating the two communities back together, coexisting like they had for decades before this violence broke out last summer.
And why the Burmese governments stand the way they have been standing towards this issue? What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I don't particularly think that I'm the right person to probably ask that particular question to. I think Phil will probably be a much better person to ask when you talk with him. I think we all have our own kind of opinions. Mine are very subjective in that sense. And, I'm a photographer first and foremost. And for me, my priority these past 7 years working in Bangladesh and just within the last 6 months of working inside of Rakhine has been to try to place a face to this very, very difficult subject matter that people really don't know too much about, to show the human consequences that the exclusion of this particular community has had on generations of Rohingya, and also at the same time to hopefully elevate the profile of this situation, desperate situation that this community is being faced with in Rakhine inside of Burma right now. With the rainy season soon about to approach over the next month or two, I think that there's, pretty good chances that there's going to be a severe humanitarian crisis based on my observations and the way that people are living, the Rohingya community are living in these IDP camps right now. So that for me has been the first and foremost objective of the work that I try to do, is to try to document, chronicle, and show through visual storytelling, what's happening in this community so that others can understand a little bit more.
And I think it's incredibly important because whilst we can read until we're blue in the face about these issues, until you see photographs such as the ones that you've taken of these people, and very, very simple black and white photographs, but the images of the faces, of the pain and the suffering and the desolateness of the people's faces is really what brings this home to you and makes you have to ask yourself, why are we at this point in our civilization, in our evolution, that wherever it is on the planet, that people like this are allowed to suffer in this way?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think that, there's, I guess in principle, everybody is born with human rights, but in practice, that's not accessible to all people. And the Rohingya community is exactly in that kind of situation. And I do think that, that the situation has deteriorated to such a point to where it really is sad to see people really living or being treated in a way that is so undignified that they feel very little hope for their future. And I've heard that from Rohingya on both sides of the border, in Bangladesh and in Burma as well. And at the same time, Burma is on the radar and on the priority lists of so many different governments, national interests, high diplomatic missions going in and out of the country for any number of different reasons, whether it be economic or policy related. And to see that, what I think a lot of people would probably would agree on as being the most significant kind of example of questions of human rights abuse in Burma right now, kind of in a lot of ways falling on the back burner of a lot of policy discussions, it seems like, or not being addressed to the point that it probably should, is a bit disconcerting at this time when Burma is actually really trying to go through these reforms.
Indeed. And there is some indication, again, as you quite rightly said on my previous question, it's more a question for Phil Robertson of the Human Rights Watch, but there is some indication that the lands that we're talking about are housing some valuable natural resources, but I'll go on and ask Phil about that later in the programme. Let me ask you, Greg, your website here, exiletoNowhere.com, where one can read about you and see some of the photographs that you've taken. You are continuing your work on the Rohingyan people throughout this year.
I am, yeah. I mean, I plan on continuing my work for the next few months. And I've these last two particular trips to Burma has been very important for the work that I want to continue doing on this particular community. I think that that there's the story of the Rohingya both in Bangladesh and inside of Burma. It's so easy to fall out of the headlines, and I think that. The journalists that continue to do work on this particular story are helping to keep the story in the news. So for me, there's still a lot of layers to peel away from this story. It's always developing. It's very fluid. The story of the Rohingya changes on a constant basis. And so for me, it's really important to kind of keep up and keep on top of that. And at the same time, I think that, for me, it's important to document both sides of the border, and I feel like I've spent 6.5 years documenting the Bangladesh side of the border, and so now I hope to kind of keep continuing to document the stories on the Burma side of the border as well.
Well, tragic as it is, it's also extremely fascinating and rich in study for you, rich in study matter for you. So I do hope that we can come back to you in not too distant future and get an update from you, Greg.
I would really enjoy that.
Thank you. Best of luck with your work, and wonderful it is. I will just remind people, exiledtonowhere.com. Do have a look at that website. Wonderful photographs, and also you can find out more about Greg and, of course, where you can buy his book. Greg, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Radio Jones on iTalk FM.
There's a look in your eyes. I see a glint of smile on your face, but I know that smile ain't mine. I will fool again.